Hey kids, I know y'all are going back to school. Make sure you do your homework and eat your vegetables. And make sure you grab some school supplies. Make sure you ask your local mutual aid organization. See if they are organizing for school supplies this year. And also, make sure you hit your local East Hill Mall. Back to school. Denim, haircut. Backpacks, come get your backpack. Boots and pants and boots and pants. Missions. Get yourself an outfit. Denim. Boots and pants and boots and pants. We have fun here, everyone. Yeah. It's not uncommon for people today to doubt themselves, to feel hopeless, to feel as if they are not reaching their fullest potential. But that's the thing, who gets to decide what is our fullest potential? Furthermore, who gets to decide our destiny for us? Who gets to decide when we have fulfilled our meaning in life? Is it your mother or father? Is it the teacher? Is it your employer? Is it the police? Is it the state? Is it God? Well, most people would point to themselves and say that they themselves get to decide the meaning in their life or the potential that they wish to seek in life. However, sometimes that measure of success is really a standard that they've adopted from other people's measure of success, and thus sometimes they impose that measure of success that they have adopted onto other people. There's nothing wrong with adopting standards from other people or other figures, but is imposing your own standards onto someone else justified in the first place? What is telling you that your standard of right and wrong is the same or compatible with someone else's standard of right and wrong? Furthermore, if you have a very specific standard of right and wrong, and if it is influenced by a hierarchical figure, then what is telling you that that hierarchical figure is a justified hierarchical figure in the first place? What if that said hierarchical figure is an imposed hierarchical figure? What if you were born under that hierarchical figure in the first place? If you were born under that hierarchical figure, is that hierarchical figure justified in being said hierarchical figure? Does the hierarchical figure stand to scrutiny in the first place? Let's do a thinking exercise. How do we know a hierarchical figure is justified or stands up to scrutiny? What are some questions that we might ask ourselves to determine whether or not a hierarchical figure is justified in the first place? One such question we might ask is, does that hierarchical figure support us in our success? When we fail, does that hierarchical figure pick us back up? Or does it leave us on the ground and ridicule us and leave us to our own devices until we pick ourselves back up? If said hierarchical figure is using the old phrase, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, then is that hierarchical figure in support of the process of us pulling ourselves up by our bootstraps? Let us ask another fundamental question. To what role does our hierarchical figure play in our trials and tribulations towards the goal? What even is the goal? Where is the goalpost? How often does the goalpost move around? Who is moving the goalpost around? And is it the hierarchical figure in the first place? Where is the starting point even? In conjunction with moving the goalpost around, does the hierarchical figure play a role as to where the starting point is? As you can see, all of these questions are rather abstract, and they cannot be answered with some simple answers, now can they? Some people would argue that these hierarchical figures are there in place to help us. Why else would a hierarchical figure put itself in its place without the intention of helping us? It has to serve some kind of purpose, right? But one might also ask, how did the hierarchical class structure get there in the first place? And why is it there? Do you believe for even a second that a hierarchical structure would be willing to support you just because? Just because it is so nice and so wonderful and so great? What if the hierarchical structure is self-interested? How do you know that it is not self-interested? Why don't we apply these abstract questions into a real-life example and see how well this example holds up to scrutiny? Let us look at the religion of Christianity. It is a hierarchical structure. In Christianity, God is the dominant force that upholds the hierarchy in Christianity. The role God plays also maintains the moral standard that Christians and followers of Christianity uphold to themselves and to others. We can determine that God is the dominating force in the upholder of Christianity because God maintains those orders and statutes and standards of Christianity. Or that's what most people would have you believe. Many Christians in the United States as well as Europe believe that Christianity is a monolith. However, that is not true. Christians are multicultural and worldwide. It is a global religion. There are Christians who are at the top of the hierarchy of capitalism and at the bottom of the hierarchy of capitalism in multiple aspects of life. In the context of the United States Empire, Christianity is the dominating force that imposes itself on others, while in several aspects throughout history, including the Armenian genocide, the post-Ottoman Empire Christian, Armenian, and Assyrian people were marginalized by the Turkish fascist empire known as the Young Turks. This genocide resulted in 3/4 of the entire Armenian population of the world being massacred at the time. However, you cannot say the same about the Christian hierarchy throughout the Vatican and the United States Empire. Constantine the Great, who decided that he was so great through his own imposition on other marginalized people groups, decided that Christianity would be the main religion of the Roman Empire. This dominant and executive decision made on behalf of a ruler that imposed itself onto others made future rulers of nation-states seem legitimate, as if the legitimacy came from the ordainment of God, or, in several other cases, seem as if they were ordained by the natural order of things. But if hierarchy is not the natural order of things, then why has hierarchy always been a thing throughout human history? Is it true that maybe the first empire, if we Google it? Ah, yes, the Circadian Empire. If the Circadian Empire was the first empire to exist, then was that the beginning of human history? Can we really make that argument? Well, no. The Circadian Empire was not the first set of people groups in human history. Before, at least, there was the Sumerian. You see, history is often told from the perspective of those who could live on to tell it. Sargon of Akkad, the ruler of the Circadian Empire, lived on to be able to tell the victories that he won by ruling over the people. But the question is even though Sargon lived to tell the story on how he dominated other people, is Sargon of Akkad a justified ruler in the first place, just because he was the one who was able to tell the story? Can we ask the same question about Christopher Columbus after he traded 2,000 slaves after quote-unquote discovering the New World? Who decided that Christopher Columbus discovered something, discovered anything, discovered land, Do you mean to tell us that Christopher Columbus had discovered something that no human has treaded before? But that's not true. Christopher Columbus was not the first human in what was called the New World. Some people would argue that Christopher Columbus brought what was called civilization to the New World, and that civilization was not functioning before Christopher Columbus. But this is also untrue, for there have been entire functioning and structural civilizations throughout the so-called New World. In fact, the New World was previously called Turtle Island. And so many people who lived throughout Turtle Island at that time were not a monolith. They were multicultural, multifaceted, with multiple and diverse structures and systems that differed from each other. These multiple and diverse structures and systems differed from each other primarily to fit the material conditions and needs for those who lived in their respective environments. But then why did Christopher Columbus make the voyage over to what he called the New World in the first place? It was because he had a job to do. He was yielding to the King and Queen of Spain. He had set out to what he called the New World to seek profitability, to seek resources, to reap the resources of other nations, to make money. There are even primary records of Christopher Columbus writing letters to the King and Queen of Spain pitching the idea that we should be trading slaves for the sake of profitability. You see, the idea that Christopher Columbus is some great and noble adventurer or ruler is straight up mythological in the first place. The only reason why the assumption that he was great is made is because he's traded slaves, made money for the king and queen, and for the sake of keeping the traditional status quo. These are the reasons why Christopher Columbus is assumed to be great. It does not take into account the fact that Christopher Columbus ended up killing indigenous people throughout not just his own lifetime, but throughout history as the Empire of the United States grew into what it became to be today. And furthermore, there's no evidence to suggest that the United States is great for its own existence as an empire. We must ask ourselves this question. The United States as an empire, how is it a legitimate or justified empire? Do the people that the United States Empire rule over consent on its legitimacy unanimously? Let's say, for example, you agree that the United States Empire is a legitimate hierarchy. What about other people that the United States Empire rules over? Do they agree that the United States Empire is a legitimate hierarchy? Let's say, for example, that those people do not agree that the United States Empire is a legitimate hierarchy. Your response might be that they should move out of the United States Empire. But what if other people from other countries not like the United States Empire as a legitimate hierarchy? A good question might be, why do these people disagree that the United States Empire is a legitimate hierarchy? There must have been some particular reason or event that the United States Empire has imposed itself on others. Well, there is evidence to suggest that the United States Empire has imposed itself on other nations and people groups for the sake of reaping their resources. There is also evidence to suggest that the United States has intervened with people's structural construction of their nation-states and governments. And it can also be observed that these interferences are usually within the interest of the benefit of the United States Empire. The structure that we live under, the United States Empire, is a competitive structure. The concept of competition is reliant on the idea of the self-interested. With this, we must ask ourselves the question, if the self-interested is only interested in their own well-being, then how do we determine that every other person who is self-interested also achieves the sense of well-being? To explore this concept even further, let us explore the concept of borders. Borders are set in place by the state for the sake of keeping something out. What is that something in this case? In the case of the United States Empire, the southern border is meant to keep out immigrants. But why would the United States have the interest of keeping immigrants out of the United States? Some people would argue that the United States is just so rich and that the United States has to protect its riches from the immigrants. But where did the United States get that wealth in the first place? The United States on its own didn't just happen in a vacuum or anything. There had to have been a labor force that built the United States Empire in the first place. Many US citizens forget to acknowledge that the US Empire was built on the backs, blood, sweat, and tears of the African proletariat. In fact, they don't even contextualize the African proletariat as such. They instead contextualize them as slaves. Though it is important to remember that they were in fact slaves under the context of the US Empire, because the US Empire expropriated the labor of stolen African slaves. The African diaspora did not consent to slavery for a settler colonial empire. Even though the kings and queens of Africa did, they do not represent the entirety of the African diaspora. Historically, Toussaint Louverture, the man who led the Haitian Revolution, a slave revolt, is not the same as King Tikbesu, the man who sold slaves to the Europeans. Kings, queens, rulers, presidents, prime ministers, popes, dictators, they do not have the consensus of all the people that they rule over. You see, borders as we know it as a concept is set in place to keep those that the rich nations expropriate from and reap the resources from out, so that the resources that they expropriate can become commodified. If we look at the context of the Latin American diaspora, where the United States Empire has intervened with the democratic and structural process of these nation-states, we can see with the examples of Chile, Brazil, Argentina, Peru, Panama, El Salvador, Guatemala, and even Mexico, we can see that US intervention and imperialism throughout those parts of the world has led to the destruction of any previously held structure for the sake of the benefit of extracting resources to build the United States Empire. Therefore, we can determine that the United States Empire, as a hierarchy, is self-interested. Now the question becomes, if the United States as a hierarchy is self-interested, is this self-interested hierarchy a justified or legitimate hierarchy? And furthermore, how does it demonstrate this legitimacy in the first place? In the concept of a vertical hierarchy, hierarchy requires a dominant factor and a dominated factor. Therefore, in the context of a vertical hierarchy, that hierarchy is a two-way relationship. In a two-way relationship, or rather in any relationship, all of the parties have to agree to the relationship. If there is a hierarchy and someone doesn't agree to that relationship, then that relationship should not exist in the first place. To demonstrate this point, let us look at the hierarchy of capitalism. If we can define capitalism as the private ownership of the means of production, meaning the ability to produce, how do we determine that that private ownership is justified? If capitalists own the commodity of labor, then how do we determine that that ownership of the commodity of labor is justified? Isn't it in such a way considered slavery? If we are to acknowledge that chattel slaves are part of the working class, then conceptually, how is that any different than, say, wage slavery? Fundamentally, there are differences between chattel slavery and wage slavery. Conflating the two is nonsensical. but conceptually at its foundational root, where one person owns the means of production and the other does not and still works for the person who owns that means of production, how is there any fundamental difference? In fact, it's important to acknowledge that there would be no wage slavery if it weren't for chattel slavery. Chattel slavery being abolished made the economic system become reformed into what we now as wage slavery. The system of capitalism does not just simply become more ethical just because there has been some reforms on how we define what slavery is. In fact, one could possibly argue that a chattel slave plantation in Alabama is not really better or worse than, say, an outsourced US plantation in Bangladesh where they pay workers less than minimum wage. The United States' response to this dilemma and this paradox is that we should vote in the election every 4 years and pick a new president. But this could not be further from the truth. Every sitting president has maintained this order of things, this status quo, this structure that imposes its imperial feet onto others. Every US president, from George Washington owning slaves to Joseph Biden commandeering the war on drugs in the 1980s and 90s, has sat down heavily on its monopoly of power with the presumption that labor is to be commodified instead of channeled for the well-being of others and oneself. Let us circle back to Christianity for a second. For all of the institutions that have sprung from the Christian religion, they all very ironically stray from the teachings of Jesus Christ. In fact, a lot of the parables said in Jesus Christ's name were never written to have some implicit value in the first place. In fact, a lot of the time, these stories were written with the intention of having the reader come to their own conclusion on their own interpretation of these stories. However, these stories have been twisted, perverted, and even culturally appropriated, specifically by people who have the interest in accumulating wealth for the sake of the self-interest. We can look at the examples of Phineas Quimby and Russell Conway. These two ministers pioneered what we can observe to be as prosperity gospel. The idea that if you just work hard in life and you do what your boss tells you to do, then you will have an eternal happiness in heaven. Even the idea that if you donate to these specific individuals, that your reward will be reflected back to you sevenfold. That sounds like a friggin' Ponzi scheme. So then, what's the conclusion here? Are all hierarchies just instantly bad? Well, no, I don't think there's such an easy answer, such as all hierarchies are bad if the hierarchy doesn't uphold the scrutiny. However, if there is an unjustified hierarchy, it ought to be abolished. In fact, not all hierarchies, whether they're legitimate or justified or not, are meant to be about maintaining power. In fact, hierarchies are in some ways rather helpful for us to understand how things are. But that's not always true either. Let us observe Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs. This hierarchy is designed for us to understand what we need in order for us to survive. However, Maslow did not create this hierarchy for us to follow it without question. Throughout its existence, people have taken issue with the hierarchy in question, including why is sex higher on the list than food? Wouldn't food be more appropriate to be higher on the list? And even further, hasn't our material condition changed over the years since the hierarchy was created? Shouldn't we account for the pandemic, or say, climate change? The most fundamental difference, though, between Maslow's hierarchy and, let's say, the state, is that the state is a dominating force that maintains its own hierarchy. Maslow's hierarchy is not being enforced by anything. There is no Maslow's hierarchy police force. There is no ingenuity to maintain Maslow's hierarchy because Maslow's hierarchy is up for change. Even with the structure of parenting, you are able to change your family. Though not always easy to change your family, but it is possible. When it comes to the state, you must comply with the laws of the state. And if the state is interfering with the well-being of your autonomy and the well-being of the autonomy of others in other nation states, then you could argue that the state as a concept is an unjustifiable hierarchy.